My name is Maya Sterling. I am 31 years old, and a few nights ago, I found myself paralyzed in the center of my kitchen, staring at my front door while the doorbell screamed in a frantic, rhythmic demand. It felt as though the past had finally tracked down my coordinates and come to collect a debt I never owed. I didn't move at first. I just stood there, my pulse thundering in my throat, because I knew exactly whose shadow was being cast against the porch light. The woman standing on the other side of that wood hadn't truly been my mother in more than 2 decades. She forfeited that title the night she vanished into a literal and metaphorical storm, choosing my twin sister, Ivy, while leaving me behind to face the rising black water alone. The unsettling part wasn't her sudden appearance. It was the sheer, jagged desperation in her movements. Through the lens of my security camera, I watched her pace like a caged animal, wiping streaks of rain or tears from her face, pounding on the door as if she could hammer her way back into a life she had walked out of a lifetime ago. Behind me, my real life breathed softly in the shadows, a home built on the foundations of safety, warm amber lights, and the kind of devotion that doesn't evaporate when the wind picks up. She had no inkling of what was waiting on the other side of that threshold. And when the latch finally clicked and she saw the reality of my existence, the color fled from her face so violently it was haunting. Her jaw dropped, her breath hitched, and she whispered a broken, "No, this isn't possible. This can't be happening." What she saw in that moment was the one thing she assumed I could never build without her permission. But to grasp why that look of pure devastation on her face mattered, you have to understand the night a hurricane dismantled my world. It was the night I learned the brutal difference between being part of a family and being the one chosen to survive. Before I reveal the confrontation that followed, I want to ask you, what time is it in your part of the world right now? And where are you watching this from? I truly want to see how far these echoes travel. I was 11 years old when I discovered that being loved and being prioritized were two very different things. We lived on the outskirts of Tampa back then, in one of those curated suburban neighborhoods where every lawn was a manicured green carpet and every family was a carefully rehearsed play for the neighbors to see. Inside our walls, perfection was a currency. It meant flawless grades, rigid discipline, and molding ourselves into the future my mother had already scripted. My twin, Ivy, stepped into that role with ease. She was the golden child, brilliant, calculated, and unshakable. I was the outlier. I was the one who filled sketchbooks with charcoal dust instead of solving science equations. I noticed the way light hit the oak trees and the subtle shifts in people's moods, details my mother dismissed as useless distractions. She used to say I had potential, but lacked the drive she valued. What she really meant was that I wasn't a mirror reflecting her own ego. The night the hurricane hit, the facade of our perfect life didn't just crack and was obliterated. The sky over Florida had turned an eerie, bruised purple, and the air felt heavy, like it was holding its breath before a scream. We had been ordered to evacuate as the storm surged toward the coast. Inside our house, it was a blur of frantic motion, suitcases being snapped shut, the clatter of pill bottles, and the rustle of important documents being stuffed into folders. In the middle of the chaos, Ivy began to spiral. Her asthma was always a barometer for her anxiety, and that night, she couldn't catch her breath. My mother's reaction was instantaneous. It wasn't the measured concern of a parent. It was a primal, tunnel-visioned panic that excluded everything else in the room, including me. She shoved a thick, waterproof plastic binder into my chest and barked an order for me to run back upstairs and grab the industrial emergency kit from the back of the linen closet. I didn't hesitate. I wanted to be the daughter who helped. I wanted to show her I could be just as reliable as Ivy. I remember the stairs feeling like they were stretching longer as I raced up them. I grabbed the heavy red bag, my heart hammering against my ribs, and turned to sprint back down. But when I reached the foyer, the heavy oak front door was swinging wide open on its hinges. Rain was already lashing against the hardwood floor in sideways sheets. I ran to the porch shouting for them, certain they were just pulling the car around to the front steps. The driveway was empty. I stood there, the emergency kit clutched to my chest, staring at the spot where our SUV had been idling just moments before. I thought maybe they were in the garage. I checked. Nothing. The street was a ghost town of wind and shadows. Then, the power grid gave out. The neighborhood plunged into a suffocating blackness, and the wind let out a roar that sounded like a freight train crashing through the trees. That was the moment the reality set in, cold and sharp. They had driven away. In their haste to save the daughter they valued, they had simply forgotten to count the one they didn't. I spent the next 3 hours locked in the downstairs laundry room, the only space without a window. I pressed a soaked towel against the gap under the door as water began to seep across the tiles, shimmering like oil in the beam of my fading flashlight. My hands shook so violently I could barely navigate my phone, but I managed to dial 911. I remember the operator's voice. Calm, steady, a lifeline in the dark. I tried so hard to keep my voice from breaking, thinking that if I sounded like a grown-up, she wouldn't hang up on me. When the rescue crew finally arrived, a firefighter wrapped me in a jacket that smelled of wet canvas and old smoke. He carried me through waist-high water to a high-water vehicle while I gripped his shoulder with a strength I didn't know I possessed. At the emergency shelter, I scanned the rows of cots, certain my parents would be hysterical with relief when they saw me. I expected my mother to collapse, to beg for my forgiveness, to hold me until my bones ached. Instead, when they finally appeared, my mother's face wasn't soft with relief, it was tight with a cold, defensive fury. She hugged Ivy first, checking her pulse, her breathing, then she turned to me, her eyes flashing. "Maya, why on earth didn't you come out when I told you to?" she snapped. My father stood behind her, looking not at me, but at the floor, exhausted by the weight of their own negligence. They claimed they assumed I was in the back seat. They claimed Ivy's breathing was the only thing they could focus on. Not once did they say the words I was starving for. "I am sorry, I failed you." In the weeks that followed, I became a ghost in my own home. My grades plummeted because I couldn't concentrate over the sound of the wind. I jumped at every slamming door, and instead of helping me heal, my parents treated my trauma like a personal insult to their parenting. My mother kept saying the house needed calm for Ivy's recovery. What she meant was that my presence, my flinching, my silence, my very existence was a constant reminder of the night they showed their true colors. 1 month later, they sat me down and told me I was being sent to Arizona to live with my Aunt Martha. They called it a fresh start. They used beautiful words to dress up a hideous act of exile. They weren't sending me away to help me. They were sending me away so they could stop looking at the evidence of their own cruelty. As I sat on that plane, pressing my forehead against the cold window, I didn't feel like a girl going on an adventure. I felt like a defective product being returned to the warehouse. That is the ultimate scar of favoritism. It teaches you that you aren't a person. You are a burden that can be moved when it becomes too heavy to carry. Arizona was a world of scorched earth and endless blue sky, a stark contrast to the humid, suffocating atmosphere of my childhood in Florida. When I first stepped into Aunt Martha's house in Scottsdale, I was bracing for more of the same conditional kindness and the feeling of being a guest in someone else's life. Instead, Martha did something I'll never forget. She didn't ask about my grades or my potential. She simply took my suitcase, looked me in the eyes, and said, "In this house, Maya, nobody is going to rush you. You have all the time in the world to just be." She had prepared a room for me with soft yellow curtains that caught the desert sun. On the dresser sat a wicker basket filled with high-quality sketchbooks, professional charcoal pencils, and vibrant pastels. I stood there staring at those supplies for so long that she eventually asked if I didn't like them. I couldn't find the words to tell her that it wasn't about the art. It was about the fact that someone had looked at me and actually seen what I loved. For the first time, I wasn't a distraction to be managed. I was a person to be known. The healing wasn't a straight line. For the first year, I still checked the driveway every evening, possessed by a pathetic, lingering hope that my parents' car would pull up and they would tell me it had all been a terrible mistake. They never came. At first, the phone calls were weakly stilted, awkward conversations where they talked about Ivy's achievements while I listened to the silence on their end when it was my turn to speak. Then, the calls became monthly. Eventually, the ringing stopped altogether. My father continued to send a monthly check to Martha for my expenses. As a teenager, I saw it as a tether to them. As a woman, I see it for the cold transaction it was. Money was their substitute for effort. It was easier to sign a check than to offer an apology. It was cheaper to pay for my life in Arizona than to pay the emotional price of loving me in Florida. Surprisingly, it was Ivy who kept the bridge from collapsing entirely. We started messaging in secret, late-night texts that turned into long video calls when our parents were asleep or out. She told me how the house felt hollow without me. She confessed that our mother became a wall of ice whenever my name was mentioned. I didn't blame Ivy. I knew she hadn't asked to be the chosen one. She was just as much a prisoner of our mother's rigid expectations as I had been. My sister wasn't my enemy, she was the only other witness to the storm that had broken us both. Under Martha's roof, I finally began to take up space. I joined design clubs, painted murals on the school walls, and learned that my worth wasn't tied to a science elective. By the time I met Liam during my junior year, I was no longer the flinching girl from the laundry room. He was helping set up drafting boards for a local architecture workshop, looking utterly ridiculous with sawdust on one sleeve and ink on the other. When he smiled at me, it wasn't a performance. It was just easy. Liam didn't just fall in love with me. He fell in love with the way I saw the world. We navigated the messy, beautiful years of early adulthood together through cheap apartments, stressful finals, and the slow realization that family is something you build, not something you're born into. When we married, the ceremony was small, held under a canopy of desert stars. Martha cried before I even reached the altar. Ivy stood by my side as my maid of honor. My parents were not invited, and honestly, their absence felt like a gift, a clean slate. A year later, our son Noah was born. Holding him for the first time changed the chemistry of my soul. As I looked into his eyes, I made a silent, iron-clad vow. He would never have to perform to be loved. He would never have to earn the right to be safe. He would never, ever have to wonder if I would stay. For a decade, I lived in this peace. I became a successful branding designer. Liam's firm flourished, and our home was filled with the kind of laughter that doesn't have an edge to it. The past was a closed book, or so I thought. The first tremor of the earthquake happened on a Tuesday afternoon. Ivy was sitting at my kitchen counter, staring into her coffee with a look of profound unease. She looked up at me and said, "Maya, Mom has been asking about you. Constantly." I felt a prickle of annoyance. People ask about the weather, Ivy. It doesn't mean they want to experience it. But then she showed me the messages. Our mother wanted to know my address. She wanted to know if I was happy. She wanted to know if I would be open to a conversation. After 10 years of silence, 10 missed birthdays, a wedding she ignored, and a grandson she had never acknowledged, she was suddenly curious. A day later, a message appeared in my own inbox. It was chillingly polite, a few sentences stating that she and my father would be in Arizona for a few days and would like to stop by. No apology. No mention of the hurricane. No admission of the decade of abandonment. Just a request for coffee, as if we were old acquaintances who had simply lost touch. I stared at the screen for hours, Part of me wanted to block her and preserve my sanctuary, but a stronger, fiercer part of me wanted her to see. I wanted her to walk into my life and realize that her attempt to break me had only resulted in me building something she could never understand. I wrote back with my address and a time. Saturday at 3 p.m. I didn't mention Liam. I didn't mention Noah. I just opened the door to the lion's den, knowing that this time I wasn't the one who would be devoured. Saturday arrived with a heavy, restless energy. I spent the morning cleaning surfaces that were already spotless, rearranging the throw pillows on the sofa, and glancing at the doorbell camera every time a bird flew past. Liam noticed my agitation immediately. He didn't try to tell me to relax. He knew that was impossible. He simply stayed close, his presence a quiet anchor in the rising tide of my anxiety. He offered to take Noah to the park to give me space, but I refused. "No," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. "This is our home. I am not hiding the life I built just to make them comfortable." Aunt Martha arrived early, bringing with her a sense of grounded strength. She didn't offer platitudes. She just squeezed my hand and reminded me, "Maya, you don't owe them a version of yourself that fits their narrative." Ivy showed up shortly after, looking pale but determined. Having my sister there was vital. She was the only person who understood the weight of the air in that room. At exactly 3 p.m., the doorbell rang. It wasn't a polite chime. It was a series of sharp, aggressive rings, followed by a heavy pounding on the wood. It was the sound of someone who believed they had an inherent right to entry. I watched them on the monitor. My father had aged significantly, his hair a thin silver, his posture stiff. My mother looked smaller, but her eyes were still sharp, darting around as she paced the porch. I waited. I let the silence of the house answer them for a long minute before I finally turned the handle. When the door swung open, the air seemed to get sucked out of the foyer. My mother was mid-sentence, likely complaining about the heat, but she froze the moment she saw me. Then, her eyes traveled past my shoulder. She saw Liam standing in the hallway with Noah perched on his hip. She saw Martha in the kitchen doorway, arms folded, and Ivy standing right beside me. The color drained from her face so rapidly it was almost clinical. Her mouth opened and closed, like a fish gasping for water. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "No, this isn't how it was supposed to be." "You wanted to see my life," I said, my voice devoid of the tremor I felt inside. "This is it." They stepped inside with the hesitant, guilty gait of people walking into a crime scene. My father kept clearing his throat, looking everywhere but at me. My mother seemed caught in a whirlwind of conflicting impulses. She wanted to cry, she wanted to hug me, and she wanted to defend herself. In the end, she did all three poorly. Liam was the perfect gentleman, offering a brief, cool nod as he introduced himself, but he stayed back, acting as a shield for Noah. The room was suffocating. Finally, I asked the question that had been burning in my chest for years. "Why now? After a decade of silence, why are you on my porch?" My mother dabbed at her eyes. "Families shouldn't stay broken forever, Maya. It's time we moved past the misunderstandings of the past." "Misunderstandings?" I nearly laughed, but it felt more like a sob. "You didn't misunderstand leaving me in a flooded house. You made a choice. And then you chose to exile me for being a witness to that choice." My father finally spoke, his voice raspy. "It was chaos, Maya. Ivy couldn't breathe. We thought you were right behind us. Fear makes people do things they regret." "The hurricane lasted one night," I countered, stepping closer. "The regret should have started the next morning. Instead, you sent me 3 states away because you couldn't stand to look at the daughter you abandoned. You didn't just leave me in the storm. You kept leaving me every single day for 10 years. My mother sank onto the edge of my sofa, looking at Noah with a hunger that made my skin crawl. "We did the best we could with what we had. she sobbed. Your best resulted in an 11-year-old girl begging a 911 operator to stay on the phone so she wouldn't die alone, I said. Aunt Martha saw the damage. She saw the girl who flinched at every loud noise and apologized for the air she breathed. You didn't do your best. You did what was easy. The silence that followed was absolute. Even Noah, usually full of babble, was quiet, sensing the seismic shift in the room. They realized then that there was no broken version of me left to fix. They had come expecting a victim they could perform an act of forgiveness upon. Instead, they found a woman who was entirely whole without them. They left 20 minutes later, my father muttering about bad timing and my mother clutching her purse like a weapon. I thought that was the end. I was wrong. 3 days later, Ivy called me, her voice shaking. Maya, check Facebook, now. My mother had gone nuclear. She had written a sprawling, manipulative post portraying herself as a grieving, rejected mother. She claimed she had traveled across the country to seek a peaceful reunion, only to be met with unprecedented cruelty and hostility. But she didn't stop there. In a move of calculated malice, she had tagged several of my professional clients and local business associates, effectively weaponizing her heartbreak to sabotage my livelihood. My hands shook as I read the comments. Some people were offering her sympathy, others were questioning my character. It was the hurricane all over again. She was trying to drown me. Only this time the water was made of lies and digital footprints. But I wasn't that little girl in the laundry room anymore. I didn't scream. I didn't retreat. I sat down at my desk and wrote a response that was as cold and sharp as a surgeon's blade. I didn't attack her character. I simply laid out the facts. I told the story of the storm, the rescue, the exile, and the 10 years of silence. I mentioned the wedding they didn't attend and the grandson they never knew. I ended it by saying, if your version of a family reunion requires me to erase the truth of my survival, then you are not seeking a daughter, you are seeking an accomplice. The reaction was a tidal wave. Ivy commented, publicly siding with me for the first time in her life. Martha posted a photo of me from my first week in Arizona, hollow-eyed, frail, and terrified, with a caption that said, I remember the girl you sent away. I helped her become the woman you're now trying to destroy. By the next morning, the narrative had flipped. The clients who had been tagged began reaching out to me, not with judgment but with support. One business owner told me she had chosen me for my honesty, and this only proved she was right. My mother's attempt to isolate me had backfired so spectacularly that she was forced to delete the post, but the damage to her reputation was done. People in her own community started asking why a woman who preached family values had treated her own flesh and blood like a disposable commodity. By the end of that week, the digital dust had settled, but the landscape of my life looked different. The Facebook post was gone, scrubbed away by the very hands that had typed it in a fit of pride. There was no public apology, no retraction, and no admission of guilt. Just the same hollow silence my parents had used as a weapon for 20 years. But this time, the silence didn't feel like a weight on my chest. It felt like a border, a clear, defined line between my world and theirs. My father sent one final message through Ivy. It was a cold, legalistic ultimatum. He stated that because I had chosen to humiliate the family, I was being officially removed from their will. He said I should consider our relationship permanently severed and expect nothing from them ever again. I didn't cry when I read it. In fact, I laughed. It was the ultimate irony. They were trying to threaten me with a future without their money, completely oblivious to the fact that they had already deprived me of a past with their love. You can't withhold a legacy from someone you never gave a childhood to, I told Ivy. The threat of disinheritance only works on those who still value the architect's approval. I had stopped seeking that a long time ago. The fallout for them, however, was far more tangible. My mother had spent years cultivating an image of a compassionate community leader, serving on hospital boards and family support groups. But when the mask slips in a small town, it's hard to put back on. People began to ask questions, uncomfortable ones. She quietly stepped down from her volunteer positions. My father's social circle narrowed. Friends who once golfed with him suddenly had busy schedules. It wasn't that I had sought revenge. It was simply that the truth is a heavy burden for those who have spent their lives building a palace of lies. The most profound change, however, was in Ivy. The sister who had been chosen finally stopped being the buffer. She didn't cut them off with a dramatic speech. She simply stopped making excuses for them. When our mother called her, weeping about how the internet had turned the world against her, Ivy finally found her voice. She told her, "The world isn't turning against you, Mom. They're just finally seeing the storm Maya had to survive all by herself." Hearing that Ivy finally saw the full shape of my scar did more to heal me than any apology from my parents ever could. A few weeks later, a summer monsoon rolled over Scottsdale. It wasn't a hurricane, but the wind was fierce, and the rain drummed against the windows with a rhythmic intensity. I was in the nursery, rocking Noah to sleep. For a split second, as the thunder rattled the glass, my body went rigid. The old instinct to run to the laundry room flared in my nerves. Then, I felt a warm hand on the back of my neck. Liam was standing there, his presence a steady, quiet reassurance. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. He just stood with me until the tension left my shoulders. I looked down at Noah. He hadn't even stirred. He was asleep, safe and deeply loved, completely unaware that a storm was even happening outside. In that moment, I realized that I had achieved the ultimate victory. The deepest justice wasn't seeing my mother embarrassed or watching her professional life crumble. It was this. My child would never have to wonder if I would stay. He would never have to earn his place in my heart. He was safe, because I had survived long enough to become the mother I never had. People love to say that forgiveness is the only path to peace, but I've learned that isn't always true. Sometimes, healing looks like distance. Sometimes, it looks like refusing to let toxic people back into your life just because you share a surname. Sometimes, the most courageous thing you can do is set a boundary and guard it like a fortress. If there is one thing I want you to take from my story, it's this. Family is not defined by blood alone. Real family is made of the people who stand in the rain with you, not the ones who drive away when the clouds turn gray. It's made of people like Aunt Martha, who see your broken pieces and help you turn them into a mosaic. It's people like Liam who hold the light when yours goes out. So, no, I don't regret opening that door. I only regret that the girl I used to be ever had to wait for someone to come back for her. I am proud of the woman I became, the one who realized she no longer needed the people on the porch to tell her she mattered. If you have ever been the one left behind, the one deemed less than or not enough, please hear me. Your story doesn't end in the dark. You are allowed to build something beautiful out of the wreckage. You are allowed to walk away from anyone who only loves you on their terms. And you are allowed to become the home you once so desperately needed. Tell me honestly, do you believe that blood always requires forgiveness, or is protecting your peace the stronger choice? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for listening to my story.